There is a specific kind of love that doesn't announce itself as a problem. It arrives quietly. It arrives in the form of someone who remembers exactly how you take your coffee, who notices when you're tired before you've said a word, who builds a life around you that is so carefully constructed, so thoughtfully arranged, that it takes years, sometimes a very long time, to understand that the life being built around you was never really for you. This is the story of Cornelius Hargrove and Laurel Ashby, and the 4 years he spent inside a marriage that looked, from the outside, like the life most people spend their entire careers hoping to be offered. It did not feel like a prison. That's the part that's almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. It felt like love. For most of it. You know that feeling when you finally get exactly what you asked for, and your first instinct is to apologize? You're sitting in a restaurant where the menu doesn't have prices. The person across from you is someone the world calls extraordinary. They've spent the last 10 minutes telling you, quietly and specifically, exactly why you are the only person who has ever truly understood them. And yet, there is a coldness in your stomach that you cannot explain to your friends. Because how do you tell someone? That perfect feels like a threat? If you have been lying awake trying to find a name for the silence in your own house, you are not looking for a story. You are looking for a mirror. And that is exactly what this is. I was at a petrol station. Mundane, gray Saturday morning in March. Filling up the car, watching the numbers on the pump climb, not even thinking about the research. Thinking about what to have for lunch. And then it just hit me. The thing I'd been reading about Cornelius and Laurel the night before. The way she described him in those early years as the perfect husband. The way that phrase sat in my chest wrong every time I read it. It wasn't a compliment. It was a boundary assessment. I remember just going very still. The pump clicked. Tank was full. But I stayed there, holding the handle, staring at the side of a white van, because I suddenly understood what I'd been looking at. Laurel didn't love Cornelius for who he was. She loved the version of him that curated her reflection. She didn't want a partner. She wanted a high-functioning presence that could validate her existence without ever making a demand of its own. I sat in the car for 10 minutes before I started the engine. Because once you see that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. We've been taught that a narcissist is someone loud, someone vain, the person who takes too many photographs and talks over everyone at dinner, the one who makes the room about themselves in ways that are legible, nameable, easy to walk away from. That's the cartoon version, and it is dangerous, because it makes the real ones invisible. The most effective ones don't look like monsters. They look like answers. They look like the person who knows what you're thinking before you say it, who saves you from your own mess, who walks into the chaos of your life and makes it, somehow, make sense. Laurel Ashby was this. She didn't dominate a room. She became the room. She understood, with the precision of someone who had been studying people since childhood, that if she provided Cornelius with a life that was 80% extraordinary, the 20% where she was quietly, carefully, removing the architecture of his autonomy, would go completely unnoticed. But here's the part that kept me awake. Cornelius didn't know he was being removed. He thought he was being loved. Look, I want to be upfront about something before we go further. I came into this with a point of view. I think the perfect partner trope, the one that circulates in certain high-net-worth circles, in certain aspirational narratives, in the specific romantic grammar of people who have achieved a great deal and are now selecting a companion with the same criteria they used to select everything else. I think that trope is one of the most sophisticated and least examined traps currently operating in intimate relationships. I've tried to follow the evidence honestly, but you should know where I'm standing. I'm standing with the person who is currently lying in a bed full of beautiful things, wondering why they feel like they're disappearing. Cornelius was 53 years old and worth somewhere north of $4 billion when he met Laurel at a private gallery opening in Manhattan. He almost hadn't gone. His assistant had put it on the calendar 3 weeks earlier. He'd meant to cancel it twice. He didn't cancel it. That detail mattered later, not because fate was at work, but because Cornelius rarely did things he hadn't decided to do. The fact that he went anyway was a small inconsistency in a man who had very few of them. Laurel was 31. She worked in brand strategy for a mid-sized consultancy, quietly ambitious in a way she had learned not to broadcast. She had the specific composure of someone who had spent years managing difficult environments. Her father had been the difficult environment and had gotten quietly excellent at reading rooms before she entered them. They spoke for 40 minutes. Cornelius was used to people performing for him. Laurelyn didn't perform. She disagreed with something he said about a piece on the wall, calmly, without softening it, without checking his reaction first, and he found himself paying attention in a way he hadn't in years. He asked for her number. She gave it to him after a pause. A pause just long enough to be genuine. They dated for 14 months. During those 14 months, Cornelius was the version of himself he was capable of being when something genuinely held his attention. Present. Curious. He remembered things she said weeks after she'd said them. He showed up when he said he would. Laurelyn noticed all of this. She also noticed something else. Something she couldn't name for a while. There were moments, small ones, easy to dismiss, where her attention felt less like affection and more like assessment. As though he were being evaluated for something. As though there were criteria she wasn't aware of that he was either meeting or not meeting in real time. She mentioned this once. Lightly. A Sunday morning, coffee, the specific, easy intimacy of a relationship that's starting to feel like home. She said, "Sometimes I feel like you're watching me. Not in a romantic way. More like you're deciding something." He laughed. Said she was the most perceptive person he'd ever met. She noticed he hadn't answered the question. She filed it away. They married in Tuscany. 40 guests. No social media. Laurelyn didn't like photographs of her private life in circulation. Cornelius understood this. He agreed to it. He thought he was agreeing to discretion. He only understood later what he had actually agreed to. Not the photographs. The photographs weren't the point. The point was the quiet removal of the marriage from any record that existed outside of her control. No one outside her approved circle knew much about their life together. No shared accounts. No tagged photographs. No evidence that Cornelius existed in Laurelyn's world in any form she hadn't specifically curated. At the time, he told himself this was sophistication. The way people who don't need external validation actually live. He wasn't wrong exactly. He was missing a layer. The first year was, by every external measure, extraordinary. A penthouse in Manhattan. A house in Connecticut. Travel that most people only encounter in magazines. And Laurelyn, who was, in that first year, the version of herself she was capable of being when something genuinely held her attention. She suggested he leave his senior advisory role at the firm. Not a demand. A suggestion. Framed carefully, in the language of opportunity. You've built enough for other people. Build something for yourself. I'll handle everything else. He left. Tried building independently. That lasted 5 months before the life they shared. The dinners, the travel, the social calendar, the particular infrastructure of Laurelyn's world, quietly consumed the space the independent work had occupied. He managed the Connecticut house. He managed the Manhattan apartment. He managed her relationship with her 2 adult children from a previous relationship, both of whom were suspicious of him in different ways that he had to navigate without a map and without acknowledgement that the navigation was even happening. He managed the charity events and the hosted dinners and the travel arrangements and the particular way Laurelyn needed things to be done, which was a very specific way that she rarely articulated in advance and always noticed in the aftermath when it hadn't been met. He was good at it. That is the thing that gets lost in the telling of a story like this one. He was genuinely good at the life. And he genuinely loved her. Both things were true. Simultaneously. Right alongside the third thing. The thing he couldn't say out loud yet. That he had slowly become someone he didn't entirely recognize. And the process had been so gradual. So carefully framed in the language of love and partnership and I just want what's best for us. That he hadn't seen it happening until he was already somewhere unfamiliar. Before I go further, I want to explain something. Because there is a concept that runs underneath this entire story, and if you understand it, everything that comes next will land differently than it would otherwise. It is called the intimacy ceiling. Not a clinical term. Not something you will find in a textbook under that exact name. But the thing it describes is real, and it has been observed consistently enough across relationship psychology that it has several formal equivalents in the literature. The intimacy ceiling is the invisible limit some people carry on how close they will allow another person to get. Not because they don't want closeness, but because closeness at a certain depth becomes more frightening than loneliness. Think of it this way. Imagine a door with a lock on the inside that looks, from the outside, like it's simply closed. You push on it. It doesn't open. You try again. Still nothing. And because there's no visible lock, Because from your side it just looks like a closed door. You start to wonder if you're pushing wrong, if you're the problem, if there's something you're missing. The person on the other side isn't being cruel. They locked the door a long time ago, in a context that made locking it genuinely necessary. And they've been behind it long enough that they've forgotten the lock is there. The reason this matters here is that everything Laurelyn did, the architecture she built, the control she exercised, the subtle repositioning that Cornelius would begin to notice in year 2, was not the behavior of someone who didn't love him. It was the behavior of someone who had a ceiling, and had never, in 51 years, been willing to examine where it was. Year 2 was when the pattern clarified. Not with cruelty. Laurelyn was not a cruel woman in the way the word is usually meant. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She didn't issue ultimatums or make him feel small in the direct, legible ways that are easier to name and easier to respond to. What she did was more architectural than that. When Cornelius expressed an opinion that diverged from hers, the conversation that followed had a recognizable structure. She would listen, genuinely, attentively, in the way he had loved from the beginning. She would engage. And then, by the end of the exchange, he would find that he had somehow been repositioned, not argued out of his view, moved, gradually, gently, to a place where his view seemed less certain, less important, less worth the friction of maintaining. He noticed this pattern around month 18. He started keeping notes around month 20. Not a formal journal. He would have resisted that word. Notes. On his phone. Time-stamped observations that he told himself were just him processing things. Just him being thorough. The notes were the thing that eventually mattered. Not because he showed them to anyone, but because the act of writing things down gave them a solidity they didn't have inside the conversations themselves. Inside the conversations, things shifted. On the phone screen, they stayed where they were. I need you to actually stop for a second. Put whatever you're doing down. Because this next part is the reason this story is worth telling. What Cornelius was experiencing had a name. Not the name most people reach for. Not the dramatic clinical label that gets applied to every difficult relationship on the internet and loses precision with every application. Something more specific. What was happening? Underneath the love, underneath the genuine devotion, underneath the life that looked like everything from the outside, was a process psychologists call the gradual displacement of self. It doesn't happen in a moment. It doesn't happen because someone decides to do it to you. It happens in the space between 10,000 small accommodations, each one individually reasonable, each one made in the name of love or harmony or partnership. Until one day you look up and the person looking back from the mirror is wearing your face, but organizing their life around someone else's gravity. The most dangerous version of this is not the one that happens in abusive relationships. It's the one that happens in loving ones. Because in a loving relationship, the accommodations feel like choices. They feel like generosity. They feel like the natural shape of two people building a life together. And they are, up to the point where they aren't. The line between those two things is almost impossible to identify from the inside while you're still standing in it. Cornelius had been standing in it for 2 years before he started to understand where the line was. This is the part of the story where I can already see the comment forming. He chose this. He knew who she was. He could have left at any point. And here is what I want to say to that, not to dismiss it, because it is a real objection and it deserves a real answer. You're right that he had choices. Every person in this story had choices. The question that interests me is not whether he had choices. It's why the choices available to him looked the way they did, and why the architecture Laurelyn had built made certain choices feel less available than others. This is not about victimhood. Cornelius himself would reject that framing. This is about something subtler and more universal. Most of us, when we love someone with our whole selves, become at least partially organized around them. The question is whether that organization is mutual, whether both people's selves are preserved in the architecture of the shared life. In Cornelius and Laurelyn's marriage, only one person's self was structurally central. The other person was load-bearing. And load-bearing is not the same as valued. Year 3. By this point, Cornelius had developed what he later described as a private internal vocabulary for what was happening. He didn't use the word narcissist. He had read enough to know the word was overused and underdefined, that it was used to describe everything from genuine personality disorder to ordinary selfishness, and that applying it too quickly flattened something that needed to be seen in its full complexity. What he used instead was the word architecture. Laurelyn built architecture. The marriage was architecture. He was a load-bearing wall inside it. He also loved her. He wrote that in the notes dozens of times, as though he kept needing to verify it, as though he were afraid that the process of understanding what was happening would somehow retroactively unmake the feeling. It didn't. That was the thing he found hardest to explain to himself. That the love was real and the problem was real, and those two things existed in the same place at the same time without canceling each other out. She was brilliant. She was, in her way, devoted to him. When he was unwell, she was attentive in a manner that was not performed. When he completed an independent project in year 2, a private investment that he had found and pursued entirely on his own, the first financial decision he'd made independently in 3 years, she was proud of him. Genuinely proud. Immediately followed by a subtle, almost imperceptible repositioning of his achievement inside a narrative about how she had created the conditions that made it possible. He noticed. He wrote it down. He didn't say anything. I want to talk about that, the not saying anything, because it is the part of this story most misunderstood when people encounter it from the outside. The assumption is that silence equals acceptance, or ignorance, or some failure of self-respect. What the assumption misses is what happens inside a dynamic like this one when you try to say something. Cornelius tried, multiple times, in the careful, specific, non-confrontational way he had learned to approach things with Laurelyn, because he had learned, by year 2, what happened when he was direct. Not punishment, not anger, something more subtle. The conversation would shift. His concern would be heard and engaged with and turned, gradually, carefully, into evidence of something about him. His anxiety, his tendency toward catastrophizing, his difficulty trusting after a difficult professional collapse in his early 40s. All of which were real things. All of which were things he had shared with her in the intimacy of the relationship's early months, never imagining they would become structural elements in a later architecture. He didn't know there was a clinical term for this. He just knew that every time he tried to name what was happening, he came out of the conversation less certain than when he'd entered it. And that by year 3, he had mostly stopped trying. The crisis came at a dinner party. Year 4, 12 guests. Connecticut. The kind of dinner Cornelius had organized and managed and executed flawlessly dozens of times by now. The flowers, the seating, the specific wine Laurelyn preferred, the way the lighting needed to be in the dining room, the temperature of the room, the timing of the courses. He was in the kitchen arranging a cheese board. Laurelyn's oldest friend, a woman named Whitmore Hale, someone who had known Laurelyn for 30 years, came in for a glass of water. They had spoken a dozen times over the years. Never alone, or never alone long enough for the conversation to become anything real. Whitmore Hale stood at the counter, looked at the cheese board he was arranging, and then said, very quietly, without preamble, without being asked. She did this with Jeffrey too. The first husband. He left eventually. I always thought he was right too. Then she took her water and walked back to the dining room. Cornelius stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he finished the cheese board, carried it out, smiled, poured wine, said nothing. I've thought about that moment a lot. The finishing of the cheese board, the carrying it out, the smile. Because what Cornelius did in that kitchen was not denial. It wasn't shock in the way shock is usually depicted, the dropped glass, the visible collapse. It was something he described later, in therapy, as the specific competence of someone who has been managing things for so long that they manage things even when the thing that just happened is the most significant thing that has happened in years. The muscle memory of the load-bearing wall, still holding the structure up, even after understanding, for the first time with full clarity, what the structure actually was. He stayed for 8 more months. Not because he was afraid. Not because he had no options. Because he was trying to understand something, whether what he was experiencing was what he thought it was, or whether he was the one constructing a narrative. Whether the notes on his phone were the record of a real pattern or the record of a man who had decided to find a pattern and had found one, because that is what happens when you go looking. This is the hardest part of being inside a dynamic like this one. The self-doubt is not planted entirely from the outside. Some of it grows from the inside, from the genuine love, from the genuine good that is also present, from the specific torture of holding 2 true things simultaneously and not knowing which one is supposed to win. 2 months of therapy helped. He went without telling Laurelyn. A practice on the east side of the city. An office that didn't announce itself. A therapist who was careful, who made clear from the first session that she was hearing one side of one story, that her role was not to provide a verdict, but to help him see clearly. In the 8th session, she said, "You keep asking me whether she loves you. I think that might be the wrong question. The question I'd ask is whether the version of you that exists inside her life is someone you recognize." Cornelius looked at the window. Outside it was raining. The specific gray way Manhattan rains in November. He didn't answer immediately. "Wait, because I want to stay in that moment for a second, not move past it. Whether the version of you that exists inside her life is someone you recognize." That sentence, right there, that is the question underneath every story like this one. Underneath every relationship that looks right from the outside and feels wrong in a way you cannot articulate. Underneath every conversation where you try to explain what is happening and find that your own words don't quite reach it. Not, "Does this person love me?" Not, "Are they a good person?" Not, "Is this technically abuse?" Is the version of me that lives inside this relationship someone I recognize? Because here is what I have come to understand, after sitting with this story for longer than I expected to. You can be genuinely loved by someone and still be gradually disappeared by them. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And the version of love that disappears you is not always the version that raises its voice or withholds affection or behaves in ways that are legible and nameable and easy to take to a friend and say, "This is what is happening to me." Sometimes the version of love that disappears you is the version that builds you a beautiful life and then slowly, carefully, removes everything from it that isn't organized around someone else's gravity. And you don't notice until you're already gone. Most people spend their entire lives reacting to this pattern without ever seeing it. You now have a name for it. You have the intimacy ceiling. You have the gradual displacement of self. You have the architecture of a marriage that preserved one person's identity completely and quietly dissolved the others. That changes everything about how you move through the world. You are no longer the person who is simply confused by a partner's perfection. You are the person who can see the load-bearing walls, who can feel the difference between a relationship that holds you and a relationship that holds you in place. While everyone else is admiring the perfect couple, you are the only one in the room who can hear what is grinding behind the wallpaper. That knowledge is a burden, but it is also the only thing that makes you genuinely difficult to disappear. Cornelius filed for separation 11 months after the dinner party. Laurelyn's response was measured, strategic, and this is the part that doesn't fit the easy narrative, the part that I kept coming back to in the research, the part that sat in my chest wrong until I found a way to hold it properly. Genuinely heartbroken. She did not perform grief. She experienced it. She called him twice the week he moved out. Not to argue, not to threaten, to say, in 2 different ways, that she didn't understand what had happened, that she had given him everything, that the life they had built was real. And I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is the most important thing I have to say about this story. She was not wrong. The life was real. Her feeling for him was real. Her belief that she had loved him well, that she had provided everything a person could reasonably be expected to provide, was real. And it coexisted, without contradiction in her mind, with the fact that she had built an architecture that left no room for him to remain fully himself inside it. Both things were true, at the same time, in the same person. That is not the story of a monster. That is the story of someone who loved with the full ceiling of what they were capable of, and never understood that their ceiling was someone else's floor. Here is the part 1 almost didn't include. The part 1 sat on for 3 months before I decided it belonged in this story. Which, by the way, is exactly what made it necessary to include. Because the details you sit on the longest are usually the ones that carry the most weight. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Laurelyn was in therapy. Not court-ordered. Not at anyone's suggestion. She went herself. She sat across from a therapist in a room in Midtown Manhattan and said, in the first session, that she didn't understand why the 2 most significant relationships of her adult life had ended in the same way. The therapist asked her to describe the way. She said, "They both left saying they didn't recognize themselves anymore." The therapist was quiet for a moment, then asked, "When they said that, what did you feel?" Laurelyn thought about it. Said, "Confused. Because I knew exactly who they were. I always knew exactly who they were." The therapist wrote something down and said, gently, "That might be where we start. I've been sitting with that exchange for a long time. Because it is not the ending most people want from a story like this one. Most people want the villain to stay a villain, want the architecture to have been deliberate, calculated, designed by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. Because that version is easier. That version has a clear moral structure. That version lets you leave the story knowing exactly where you stand. This version doesn't give you that. This version gives you something harder and more accurate. A woman who loved genuinely and controlled completely and never understood that those two things were happening simultaneously. A man who was genuinely loved and gradually disappeared and spent 4 years unable to fully name what was happening because the love was real enough to keep casting doubt on the pattern. Two people who both experienced the marriage as real, and who were both, in their own way, right. The two truths problem. It cannot be resolved cleanly. I have tried. The divorce took 11 months. Cornelius walked out of the attorney's office on a Tuesday in October, stood on the sidewalk, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like himself. He couldn't entirely explain what that meant. He wrote about it in the notes that night, the last entry, as it turned out. He wrote, "I don't hate her. I spent a long time being afraid I would, and I don't. I just finally understand that loving someone and being safe with them are two completely different things. And I spent 4 years confusing one for the other." He sat with that sentence for a while, then put the phone down, went to bed, slept for 10 hours. The first uninterrupted sleep he'd had in longer than he could remember. I don't know where you're watching this. Maybe it's late. Maybe you're supposed to be doing something else right now. Maybe you came across this video because something in the title landed in a specific way and you're not entirely sure yet what that means. But if you've made it this far, I think you already know why this story matters to you specifically. And I'm not going to name what I think that is. Because the most important things in a story like this one are the things you recognize without being told to recognize them. The things that land before you've consciously decided to let them. That recognition is information. Pay attention to it. I almost wish I hadn't found this story. Not because it isn't worth telling, but because once you understand what was actually happening underneath all of it, underneath the beautiful life, underneath the genuine love, underneath the 4 years of a marriage that looked from the outside like everything, you cannot go back to the version where it was simply a sad story about two people who couldn't make it work. It is something more specific than that now, and more uncomfortable. The comfortable version is, she was a narcissist. He was a victim. He escaped. The end. The uncomfortable version is the one I've been trying to tell you. That the narcissist was also someone who loved. That the victim was also someone who stayed, not from weakness, but from the specific, complicated, entirely human difficulty of leaving something that is genuinely real, even when it is also genuinely harmful. That the architecture of control and the architecture of love can occupy the same building. And from the inside, the two are almost impossible to tell apart. Here is what I want you to carry out of this story. The question that this story keeps opening, the one I've been circling since that Saturday morning at the petrol station, since I first understood what I was actually looking at, is not really about Cornelius. It is not even really about Laurelland. It is about a specific kind of love. The kind that arrives with full attention and careful memory and a beautifully constructed life. The kind that is, in every legible and visible way, devoted to you. The kind that makes the people around you say, "You are so lucky," in a tone that makes you feel, privately, like the luckiest and the loneliest person in the room simultaneously. The question is, how do you know the difference between someone who loves you and someone who loves a version of you they have constructed? And the harder question underneath that, the one I genuinely don't have a clean answer to, the one that kept me awake on more than one night while I was sitting with this research. How would you know? If you were already inside it? Now, here is the thing I held back. The thing I didn't say earlier because it needed to land here, at the end, after everything else, to mean what it actually means. This is the watch-through reward. The reason the people who stayed until now got something the people who left early didn't. When Cornelius was in therapy, 8 months after the divorce, in the same East Side practice where he'd first started going without telling Laurelland, his therapist asked him a question he hadn't been asked before. She said, "When you think about the marriage, not the end of it, not the pattern you identified, but the marriage itself in its early years, who were you inside it?" He thought about it for a long time, then said, "I was the best version of myself I'd ever been." The therapist didn't respond immediately, then said, "And whose version was that?" Cornelius went very still, because he understood, in that moment, something he hadn't fully understood before. The most sophisticated thing Laurelyn had done, more sophisticated than the architecture, more sophisticated than the repositioning, more sophisticated than the intimacy ceiling, was this. She had made him better. Not in a manufactured way, not in a way that was false. Genuinely better, more confident, more socially fluent, more professionally respected, more fully realized in the ways the world measures realization. And in doing so, she had made leaving feel like self-destruction. Because leaving her didn't just mean leaving the marriage. It meant leaving the version of himself that the marriage had produced. It meant walking away from the only witness who had watched him become who he was, and who held, in her memory and her narrative and her carefully constructed account of their shared history, the only record of his becoming. This is what the research calls the narrative sunk cost. Not just the years, not just the life, the story. The narcissistic partner, whether they understand what they are doing or not, becomes, over time, the primary historian of your existence. They are the ones who remember your growth, who witnessed your becoming, who hold the version of you that you are most proud of inside their account of who you are. And leaving them feels like burning the only library that contains the story of who you became. Cornelius stood outside his attorney's office on a Tuesday in October and felt like himself. But it took him another 18 months in therapy to understand what that meant. To build a record of his own becoming that didn't require her as its keeper. To understand that his history belonged to him, even when there was no one there to confirm it. You do not need a witness to be real. Your story belongs to you. Even if the person who taught you that it mattered is the same person you had to leave to remember it. You're probably thinking of someone specific right now. Not yourself. Someone else. A friend who is with a person the world calls extraordinary and who seems, month by month, to be getting quieter. A sibling who has traded the messy, specific, difficult version of themselves for a polished life, and a partner who is, by every external measure, everything. Don't send this to them with a lecture. Don't send it with a diagnosis. Send it as an act of care. Say, I watched this, and it made me think of how much I missed the version of you that existed before you got so good at everything. That sentence is more powerful than any clinical term you could reach for. Some people, when they love you, see who you are. And some people, when they love you, see who they need you to be. And the terrifying thing, the thing that makes a story like this one matter, is that from the inside, in the early years, in the years when the love is real and the attention is full and the life being built around you feels like the answer to a question you'd stopped believing anyone would ask. Those two things feel identical. I want to end on something I genuinely don't know the answer to. Not a tidy conclusion. Not a reframe that makes the discomfort resolve into something manageable. Just the question I've been sitting with since I first understood what I was looking at. Laurelyn Ashby is in a therapist's office in Midtown Manhattan. She has said, they both left saying they didn't recognize themselves anymore. The therapist has said, that might be where we start. And I find myself wondering, not whether she is capable of change. That is almost beside the point. I find myself wondering whether she, sitting in that office, is experiencing something she would describe as love for the people she lost. Or something she would describe, if she were being fully honest, as the specific grief of someone who built something extraordinary and watched it refuse to stay. I don't know which one it is. I'm not sure she does either. And I think that uncertainty, that specific, uncomfortable, unresolvable uncertainty, is the most honest thing I can leave you with. Drop this in the comments. Did you feel more for him or for her by the end? And what does your answer tell you about how you love? There is no right answer, but the one you give honestly tells you something worth knowing.